Hi, we're continuing on the series of borderline personality disorder videos for parents who have children or young adults in their home with BPD. I had previously put out a series of videos based on my book, Borderline Personality Disorder Survival Guide, From Chaos to Authenticity. And what I'm going to talk about today is something that I think is crucially important, and that is that parents are going to have their hands full. Whether it's a single parent household or a two caretaker or parent household, you're going to have your hands full. It's crucially important that the parents are able to present a united front. It is crucial that they're in agreement about things even when they're not in agreement. If this is a real problem, go to a family therapist or a third party so that the parents can work these issues out. Inevitably, each parent will have a different relationship with each child for different reasons based on gender, age, birth order, hobbies, interests, even physical appearance, and so on. When the parents are not in agreement, it could be an opportunity for the child to take advantage of the situation by using splitting or projective identification. We're going to talk about those in a second, which are traditionally seen as defense mechanisms for borderlines, but in my book I have them as actual clinical criteria. We don't want one parent to be demonized. We don't want the other parent to be idealized. We want everybody to be on the same page, including other family members, and not just the child with borderline personality disorder, but siblings and whoever lives under the roof. First, I want to talk a little bit about projective identification in this context. Projective identification allows the borderline to contend with anxiety-provoking or perhaps even overwhelming thoughts and feelings by vicarious identification through another person, usually someone with whom the borderline has a close connection, such as, obviously, a parent who lives under the same roof with them. Rage, for example, can be an overwhelming feeling and even potentially dangerous. It is more psychologically economical for the borderline to identify with someone who contends with rage as a means for the borderline to contend with his own rage. Sometimes the borderline consciously chooses a partner or a friend or targets towards a parent where projective identification is possible. At other times, the borderline finds himself in relationships to his advantage to contend with various vicariously difficult psychological issues. Because the borderline does not have the mature cognitive or ego-defensive tools to critically consider or contend with his own negative thoughts and feelings, he may become hypercritical and impatient with the person with whom he experiences projective identification, creating a love-hate relationship. You can imagine that this is extremely relevant with children who have borderline personality disorder in the home with parents, where they are able to project their rage, their self-esteem issues, frustrations, their hurt onto the parent, because the parent can absorb it. There's so many problems with this, and we'll talk about it, but one of the issues is the parent must recognize this, the parent must not allow this to happen, and the parent must talk about these issues with the child, if not directly, then in the context of family therapy or whatnot. It's essential that the parent clarifies, just as we had with the video with psychotic ideation, that the parent clarifies with the borderline child that the borderline child is actually doing this, because the child may not be fully conscious even of the projective identification. And when the person is not conscious of it, they may utilize this as a developing normative means of communication. When that child grows through adolescence and young adulthood and beyond, the danger is that that child, when the parent is no longer under the same roof, that borderline adult now will utilize that as a means of communicating and interacting emotionally, psychologically, and socially with other people. And other people are not going to put up with it. They're going to feel it's destructive and harmful. They're going to feel that they're being taken advantage of, manipulated, or controlled, or possibly coerced. And that's why it's very important that this is recognized and dealt with. While projective identification is a defense mechanism and symptom that often occurs in the context of a single interpersonal relationship, splitting can occur in a single relationship, a dyad, or multiple relationships, allowing the borderline to maintain contradictory ego states, even given his fragmented sense of self and other. I don't want to forget, so I just want to mention here as an aside, even though there's two parents, one can imagine, because of the high rate of separation and divorce, that the parents are living in separate homes. When the parents are living in separate homes, it's much easier for the borderline child to present in two very different ways with the two parents, because the parents aren't socially interacting with one another, and they're probably not in a healthy way sharing vital information about the borderline's health and well-being as an adolescent or even young adult. And the splitting and the projective identification can be much easier effectuated by the borderline when the parents are not living in the same home. So you can imagine going, for example, to mom's house on the weekend and complaining bitterly about dad, and then going back to dad's house for the weekdays and perhaps complaining bitterly about mom. And mom and dad are not talking, so they're not comparing notes about the child's behavior, emotional well-being, and so on. Getting back to splitting, there are different ways to understand splitting. The borderline uses splitting because contending with unconscious conflict is psychologically overwhelming, and so the borderline splits aspects of his conflict, such as love and anger, into extremes comprised of idealization and devaluation. One day the borderline may idealize his parent as the greatest person in the world, and another day spew vicious verbal abuse towards him or her. Yet one of the cornerstones of healthy maturity is understanding that almost everyone has both negative and positive aspects to their qualities and their person. So seeing the world in gradients and shades without anger and without recrimination is really the most important thing that the borderline has to do when they develop. And that, by the way, is true for everyone, for every healthy individual. We ultimately understand that our parents were not perfect. They had some positive aspects to their personality, perhaps some negative aspects to their personality, but we love them because we take them as a whole. Splitting, therefore, also occurs with multiple individuals. For example, a child with BPD may view one parent as all loving and giving, and the other parent as neglectful and even abusive, so that the borderline does not have to contend with the unconscious conflict and reality that all caregivers have both positive and negative aspects. And this is particularly true, as I said, in our world where so many parents are separated or divorced and therefore living in different homes. The borderline, therefore, may even play off two parents against each other, ultimately causing parents to become emotionally exhausted and useless as caretakers. Projective identification and splitting, ultimately mechanisms of denial to stave off unwanted thoughts and feelings, often mean that the borderline suffers from weak or diffuse ego boundaries. And that's something I want to talk about for a few minutes now. Borderlines often have weak or diffuse ego boundaries, often struggling to understand where their needs, thoughts, and feelings and identities start and stop in relation to other people. And it's not unlike the character Zelig in Woody Allen's movie, where this character takes on the identity and personality of whoever he's with. Weak or diffuse ego boundaries can lead to a wide range of identity disturbance and interpersonal problems, including enmeshment with someone else. Projective identification and splitting used by the borderline helps to promote the diffusion of his ego boundaries and may even cause the borderline to feel better about himself, seeing someone with similar problems who is even worse off and perhaps even struggling to survive. When weak ego or diffuse boundaries occur, the borderline may become overly influenced and deferential, allowing the other person to control the borderline to his detriment. We said this in an earlier video, but don't forget that although we're concerned with how the parent contends with the borderline child, there's genetics, and it's quite possible that one or both of the parents is also someone with borderline personality disorder or have aspects of that disorder, and the borderline child may recognize that. The borderline child may recognize, for example, the rage that a parent has, and the borderline child will contend with his own rage through the parent's rage vicariously. Weak ego boundaries have many secondary negative issues, as it often leads to feelings of envy and jealousy. For example, jealousy is a normal feeling, but with borderlines, the jealousy is not a feeling, but something that connects with the borderline's very identity and needs. When we feel jealous because someone has an expensive car, we may enviously wish that we own the car, perhaps the money to pay for it, or even a better job so that we can have the money to buy the car. However, the borderline's jealousy and envy can be pathological in the sense that it reflects not only his feelings of desire, but fundamentally affects how the borderline defines himself. One of the issues we see here is not only with parents, therefore, but also with siblings, not just peers and classmates in the environment, but siblings, where the borderline may become very, very envious and desirous of a sibling, as we see in the case of Cain and Abel in the book of Genesis. This is sometimes referred to as mimemic. Mimemic desires are not biological or intellectual drives, but rather desires framed by the needs of others who we perceive as having a higher or special status, hoping that the person will guide us to that desired goal. For this reason, it can also be difficult for the borderline to choose something he desires on his own, because the borderline craves validation, confirming that his desire has value or meaning. This can also lead to anger, rage, low self-esteem, self-recrimination, and intense frustration. The borderline may even feel so intimately connected with the expensive car that he envies that he may ingratiate himself into the life of the owner as a means to become part of the car owner's life and identity. A great example of pathological jealousy is in the movie A Kiss Before Dying with the character Jonathan Corliss. When the borderline is unable to satisfy or contend with deep feelings of jealousy, he may feel such contempt for the other person, including a sibling or parent even, barely able to hide his disgust, that it may be necessary for the borderline to create an artificial identity to fit into the world of the household. As such, weak or diffuse ego boundaries may create for the borderline a false sense of attachment, belonging that almost inevitably causes disappointment or anger. Another major issue with weak or diffuse ego boundaries is that the borderline tends to overshare his thoughts and feelings with parents and even with peers. The borderline may feel that when he shares his thoughts and feelings, he is misunderstood, or that his thoughts and feelings are improperly used by others against him. In failing to retain a private identity, the borderline feels that parts of him are chopped off, and he will sometimes share inappropriate thoughts and feelings, making other people feel uncomfortable. This boundary issue is particularly important not just with the borderline child's siblings and classmates, but with the parent, because clearly the parent has a particular role as an adult and as a caretaker. And the child has a particular role given his or her age, the grade and responsibilities towards school and the individual's development. The more these boundaries become blurred, the more dangerous it becomes. There's this great movie called Heathers where the father and son have this pathological relationship, and they actually refer to one another in the movie in the opposite way. So the father calls the son father, and the son calls the father son. So their actual name, the identification, is switched given the unhealthy lost ego boundaries and roles and how these individuals communicate. Another corollary of weaker diffuse ego boundaries is that the borderline tends to have strong feelings or opinions on issues that may be quite unrelated to the borderline's life as he over-identifies with other people's issues. The borderline then inserts himself into someone else's affairs and assumes that he can help. In fact, he can barely help himself. For example, borderlines tend to identify with social equality issues, often advocating for justice and fairness because the borderline's own internal world is marked by chaos and perceived internal imbalance and injustice. Borderlines tend to have strong opinions, do not suffer fools gladly, and can become easily distracted when his sense of right and wrong is challenged. We see this so often with borderline adolescents and young adults who adopt social issues with regard to the environment, social criminal justice, and so many other things. These are not bad issues for your child to take up. These can be very good and worthwhile causes. But it reflects the sense of injustice internally, unfairness that the borderline is dealing with, and externalizes it. The borderline may then attack the parent, saying, why aren't you worried about the environment? Why aren't you worried about social justice? Why aren't you worried about LGBTQ issues? Because aren't they important to you? Aren't they a value that we all share together? The bottom line is that with regard to projective identification and splitting and ego boundary issues, the parents must remain united. They must talk with one another, and they must talk with the child in an appropriate manner, allowing the ego boundaries between parent and child, adult and youngster, to remain intact. This can be overwhelming, and one of the ways actually for the parents to remain united is not to be at home. And by that I mean the parents once a week or whatever, a couple times a year, should go on vacations by themselves to reestablish that they are adults and that they have separate lives and responsibilities and separate needs and wishes, and they do different things than the children. It's fine as an adult to act like a child, but when the child has such a weak sense of identity that it's important that the parents have you time, that the parents have particular time for themselves, and especially outside of the house where they do things and go on vacations. If you want to do something inside of the house, have a movie night, just the parents, without the children. Get a pizza, sit in the den by yourselves, close the door, and have the children, especially the borderline child, understand that it's not always appropriate for that child to be involved in the parent's life, just as it's not always appropriate for the parent to be involved in the child's life. And the parent needs to guard against this also, because the parent may become overly involved because, for example, if the borderline child is involved with alcohol or drugs or sex or unsafe activities, the parent is going to hover and check every day, multiple times. Are you okay? Are you okay? What's going on with you? Who are you speaking with? What are your activities? Who are you on phone with? So that because of the parent's natural worry, given the borderline child's unsafe behaviors, it's reasonable for the parent to check off. And yet, even then, appropriate boundaries must be maintained because it serves as a model of proper behavior and proper personal relationships between one person and the next. When the parents can't agree, it's important to also understand that the borderline child sometimes has difficulty distinguishing between normal everyday arguments between parents and real pathological and serious problems. So that's important to clarify for the borderline child after the parents have spoken with themselves as to what's going on, and to clarify that the world is not falling apart, so that they're on the same page explaining to the child these issues in a clear way, so that the child does not make any assumptions or fill in the blanks and develop erroneous ideas in their head about what's going on.